Hi there, my name is Matt Furness and this is The Culture Hack, a video and podcast series that captures experiences and life lessons from those who know culture best. The goal? To help you to understand, design and change your company culture. Thanks for tuning in. Hi everybody and welcome to The Culture Hack. It's Matt Furness here from Click Culture Consulting and I'm joined today by Franck Brown. Now, Franck is a neurodiversity coach, educator and trainer. He's the founder of Conscious Clarity, an organization that supports both neurodivergent people in the workplace and helps organizations to get the most from and the best from neurodivergent talent. And I'm really looking forward to speaking to him today. So welcome, Franck. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Always love speaking to you. Really excited. Back from holiday, ready to go. So yeah, really excited to speak to you today.
Sounds good. Thanks for having you on. Thanks for coming on. Sorry. So we'll be talking today about the intersection between company culture and neurodiversity. But first, tell us a little bit more about your story and your background.
Yeah, sure. So, long story short is that I'd grown up wanting to work in FMCG, so fast-moving consumer goods. I was lucky enough to have that career. Got my sort of economics degree. Worked for a number of companies like Mondelez, which is the parent company to Oreo, Cadbury, Toblerone, a lot of my favorite snacks. Worked at Innocent Drinks and the company behind Patax and Blue Dragon in sort of a number of different sales and marketing roles. Throughout that career and really enjoyed it. But equally, I knew sort of growing up that there was something about me that was a little bit different to others, and it was really difficult to pinpoint. I'd sort of put it for the majority of my life to the fact that I've got a sort of international background, sort of dual nationality, two different languages in the household, and I sort of thought it was a cultural thing. And that led to sort of a couple of struggles at school, university, the workplace, sort of high highs and low lows during my career. And I thought, something's going on here beyond this cultural element, surely. And at the age of 30, I thought, you know what, I want to look into this. I was diagnosed with ADHD at 30. I've skipped over the fact that I was diagnosed with dyspraxia at 20, but I had no idea what that was and did nothing with it. And perhaps that's something we get into. But yeah, this revelation that I thought, oh wow, I'm 30 years old. I've gone all this time without knowing I've got this ADHD diagnosis as well as dyspraxia. I've never thought about the fact that these types of things could be impacting me. I'm really interested in exploring it. My diagnosis led directly to my mother's diagnosis in her 60s. She doesn't mind me saying that. But there was this realization that, wow, between us, we've gone through nearly 100 years of life and not known about it. Others in our family have since been diagnosed. And I thought, I want to be part of the solution, not the problem. I had so many questions and you don't necessarily know who to turn to. So that I decided to take a bit of a leap into self-employment, retrained to become a coach in and around neurodiversity. And as you say, I coach individuals, groups, and train organizations all around neurodiversity and getting the best out of yourselves and your talent.
Awesome. And I think I would love to know how, when you received those diagnoses, did you feel like they were surprising, or did they just help to make sense of lots of things that previously hadn't made sense to you? And in particular, what were those things that now made sense in light of these diagnoses?
Yeah, great question. So I'm sure you and your audience or many of your audience will be familiar with the change curve and the sort of reaction to shocks or, big changes in our life. The simplest version I always sort of refer back to is that we go through 4 stages. They generally tend to be denial, anger, grief, and acceptance. There are different versions of the model, of course. I mention it because I went straight to acceptance. I think because I had sort of struggled at university where I was putting in more effort than ever, but sort of failing exams for the first time. I'd had sort of certain periods of my life where I had been doing really well. Say I had a job in my career, I'd done really well in that job, got promoted, moved to a different job, and struggled. I thought, well, I haven't got any stupider. I hope I'm not working any less hard, but surely, there's this sort of an environmental factor here, or there's some other sort of factor at play. So I generally went straight to acceptance because I had sort of seen certain elements of my life where things
Mm,
felt disproportionately hard or disproportionately easy. Um, though I recognize that for a lot of people, they don't necessarily go straight to acceptance. Sometimes there is an element of denial, this idea that, like, oh, I can't have it, or, anger, oh my God, this is going to have so many implications, or grief, like, oh my God, this is my new normal. And that's what coaching can be there to help with in some cases.
mm,
But by and large, for a lot of people you speak to, a diagnosis can be quite sort of cathartic. This sort of
mm,
reassurance that I'm not stupid. I've been perhaps just a little bit misunderstood, and I haven't known everything there is to know about myself. A common theme I come back to a lot is this idea of we don't know what we don't know. And as I say, for a big part of my life and my family's lives, it had been playing a part, this sort of neurodiversity element had been playing a part in our whole family without us knowing.
mm,
And so it's
mm,
quite
mm.
common when you speak to people that they talk about life before and after, even though it was already there. It's
Yeah.
more like before I knew, now I know, that sort of thing.
Yeah. There's this whole debate around whether the labels are even helpful, but it sounds like in your sense, it's really helped you to get a clearer sense of understanding of your own behavior and the behavior of people around you. So, what I'd love to do is step back and go, what do we actually mean by neurodiversity, neurodivergence? I think it's one of those things people broadly get it, but like, let's get specific. What does it mean? What does neurodiversity mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get stuck in. We could do a whole hour on this. We won't. But yeah, in essence, we're all neurodiverse. So let's start there. Much like we accept that nature is diverse. We consider diversity in other parts of our lives. We don't often think about the fact that our brains can and might and maybe should be different too, right? So we're all neurodiverse in that sense. The way I often think about it is if we are baking a cake, I'm going to go on a little baking metaphor here for you, Matt. So
It's good.
hopefully it's not too abstract. But if we're baking a cake, we might need some flour, some butter, some milk, some eggs, some chocolate, whatever it might be. If we consider those the sort of traits that we have as individuals, you might have more of one trait than another, and specifically, you might have more of one trait than I do. And so if we're thinking about this comparison between traits and ingredients, we're all sort of different mixtures of ingredients, right? And that is where neurodivergence comes in. This idea that from a medical standpoint, reaching a certain threshold of uh, the medical criteria for those traits will lead to a diagnosis. So if you have loads of one ingredient, it could be, for example, I know in my case, I have quite slow processing speeds. So let's just say my cake doesn't have very many eggs in it, right? You might have very high speed processing. Similarly, it could be spatial awareness, cognitive thinking, could be working memory, all these types of traits. And in order to be diagnosed with something, you have a sort of medical threshold, and you might be above it for certain ingredients, certain traits, and that would lead to a
Mm,
diagnosis. But for the most part, people who are considered neurotypical have a sort of regular mix, shall we say, where nothing is particularly high or low in their um,
mm.
presence. So we talk about spiky profiles as well, which
Yeah.
comes in.
That was going to be my next question actually. But just before we get onto that, so just to summarize my understanding of what you're
Yeah.
saying then. So
Mm.
neurodiversity and neurodivergence are different things. Neurodiversity is just the idea that our brains are all different and everybody is neurodiverse, right? Because everyone's brain is different. Neurodivergence is specifically when those differences almost go beyond a particular sort of medically prescribed range of what is sort of typical or yeah, typical or common. Is that right?
You have done such a better job at explaining that than I tried to with my strange analogy. And I can assure you that it works much better when I present that visually. But
No,
you've described that exactly right. And so
good.
we tend to talk about, we move away from the idea of normal. There is no such thing as normal or average. We talk about neurotypical. So people who have what would be considered a more standard profile with fewer extremes in those traits. And then we talk about neurodistinct or neurodivergent, who would be generally diagnosed with condition. Could be ADHD, could be dyspraxia, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, um,
Mm, mm,
autism. Sometimes referred to as ASD. More commonly now we talk about it as ASC. Um, the D being disorder, and we're trying to move people away from talking about these conditions as disorders,
yes.
as there's,
Yeah.
we don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with having them. Instead, we want to sort of normalize the language of having a condition. Being pregnant is a condition, for example, and we want to sort of normalize the language around that. So
Yeah.
yeah, on one hand, you've got neurotypical, and then you've got neuro distinct is my preference. A lot of people call it neurodivergent, each to their own.
Can I check my understanding with something? Because if I take something like autism
Sure.
or dyspraxia, my
Mm.
understanding is that is almost like a constellation of different aspects, right? So autism might have, I think there's like hypersensitivity to like audio visual stuff. Then you've got like being hyperlogical, etc., right? So you've almost, so it might be that you score almost beyond that that sort of, be in the sort of neurodivergent uh, range or beyond that neurodivergent threshold for maybe one or two of those, but not of all of them. Um, and that's when it starts to
That
get
is
messy. That's my
exactly right.
understanding. That's how I've understood it until this conversation? Is that right, or have I misunderstood that?
That's exactly right. Yeah, and
Okay,
each condition will have different diagnostic thresholds. To make things confusing, sometimes there are different methodologies used as well, but we won't go there.
okay.
As you say, each condition will have different sort of traits that the assessor will be looking for.
Mm,
And
mm,
it's incredibly common that if you have one condition, that you also have another. So as I say, I'm both dyspraxic and I have ADHD. It's really common to see the ADHD autism overlap, and so many other sort of different combinations thereof as well.
yeah, because I think that's when people sometimes get confused because what they'll do is they'll associate for 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 argument's sake autism with perhaps like social awkwardness or a lack of eye contact, some of those stereotypical traits, but then they meet someone who says they're autistic because they score high on some of those other you know facets of autism. So but it might be things that you don't necessarily see as readily, and then people struggle to understand it and recognize it as they still have autism. It just exhibits itself
Mm.
differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a reason why, in the case of autism specifically, there's a reason why it's called a spectrum condition, which is exactly what you just talked about, that it will present differently in different people. And people will, there's not one way to
Mm,
be autistic. There's not one way to have ADHD. Everyone's experience will be different and everyone's
mm,
experience will be valid. It's really just a case of understanding what it means for you as an individual, the impact of that on yourself, on others, that sort of thing. And what you've touched on there is, quite a lot of stereotype. Even if we look at Hollywood,
mm, mm,
people tend to think of autism and they go, "Oh, that's Rain Man," and it's not Rain Man.
mm,
That was a
mm,
different condition.
mm,
They think of
mm,
Sheldon from Big
mm.
Bang Theory. These sort of quite dialed up, quite
Yes.
Hollywood, where sort of elements of the condition are sort of dialed up to suit a narrative that isn't necessarily reflective of the everyday person or that helpful. So
Yeah.
yeah, as you say, stereotypes can play a really big part in that as well.
And let's get away from the stereotypes, talk about then the facts
Mm.
of, I think the way you described it before is a spiky profile, right? So what we mean,
Yes.
what I think it sounds like you mean by is almost like sort of those neurodivergent people have more of a spiky profile. So tell us a little bit more about what that spiky profile looks like and what the
Yeah.
sort of the pros and drawbacks of having a spiky profile might be.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Great question. So Again, if we think about a neurotypical profile, we'll have, if you were to take just 100 people, let's say, at random, and you were to test them on things like working memory, I don't know, emotion regulation, long-term memories, spatial awareness, coordination, whatever your metrics might
Mm,
be, the neurotypical percentage of the population, which is about 80 to 75 to 80% of the population is considered neurotypical. They would have relatively consistent scores. So
mm,
what that means is I often sort of describe it as a neurotypical person generally finds it quite easy to be like a 5 or 6 out of 10. And what I mean
mm,
by that
mm,
is that, you can dial things up, you can dial things down, the wheels don't fall off. My experience of ADHD, and I can only speak for my experience of ADHD, is that you tend to be a 9 or a 1,
mm,
and you sort of flick between these extremes. And so by being neurodivergent, by being neurodistinct, what it tends to mean is that you have high gaps between your
mm,
strengths
mm,
and your weaknesses, or your challenge areas. I remember one manager saying to me in my career, Frank, your output can be amazing. It's when you're on a roll, you're doing fantastic. I just want you to be a bit more consistent. And again, I didn't know about any of this stuff. So now I hear about it, or now I know about my condition and I understand
mm,
neurodiversity. I
mm,
look back and I think that makes so much sense to me now. This idea
mm,
that I was working at a 9, the output was really good, but then
mm,
there comes a point where maybe I'm not putting the brakes quickly on enough, and so I'm burning out, or inevitably your emotions and energy levels tire, or whatever it might be.
mm,
So yeah, that's how I tend to think about the spiky profile. A really simple way of thinking about it is it's sort of the opposite of a jack of all trades.
yes.
Or it's the opposite of someone who is an all-rounder. Now, many ADHDers or many ND individuals will consider themselves all-rounders. So I'm not saying you can't be
Mm,
an all-rounder. What I'm
mm,
saying is you tend to see more sort of specialized strengths and
yes.
more sort of identifiable challenge areas
The
with those
language
peaks.
you used earlier that I thought was really interesting was you
Mm.
said going through school things felt disproportionately easy or disproportionately hard. And I imagine that was because of your spiky profile, right? The things that felt disproportionately easier, they're the things that really strong on, but the things that were disproportionately hard were the things that you were just really weak on. Um, that's sort of, it sounds like that was what's going on. Is that right?
I think you've got that spot on. And, when you're growing up, you don't always have a huge amount of self-awareness. You also don't
Mm,
necessarily have um, the maturity to understand what's going on, or certainly I
mm,
didn't. And you're exactly right. It was sort of learning over time that, oh, hang on, um, I'm actually surprised that other people can't do this. But then equally,
mm,
there are other very fundamentally basic things that I can't do.
mm.
It's sort of a joke within my friends and family. I'll sit down at a table and I'll just spill my water everywhere, or knock the
Yeah,
table and cutlery
yeah.
goes flying. That sort of thing. I'm quite mal coordinated in that sense. Again, part of the linked to the dyspraxia.
Mm,
So things that you think, well, Frank, why can't you just sit at a table?
mm,
I find quite hard. But then there
mm.
might be other things like problem solving, which I love, or creativity that come really naturally.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, you asked about strengths, because sometimes, as you say, sometimes we can focus so much on the negatives.
Mm,
Even the term ADHD, you've got attention deficit, you've got hyperactivity, you've got
mm,
disorder. So just within the name, you've got three things that are supposedly wrong with you.
mm,
And that having ADHD doesn't mean you have necessarily attention deficit. It doesn't
mm,
always mean hyperactivity. And as we've
mm.
touched on, in my opinion, and in a lot of people's opinion, it's not a disorder, it's a condition.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
we sometimes get bogged down by the drawbacks, but actually
Mm,
we don't think about the strengths, which can be hyper focus, creativity, innovative thinking,
mm, mm.
problem solving skills, regardless of the condition. You do
Yes.
see strengths. So it's not just about weaknesses. It's not about deficits.
So we're starting to talk now about the strengths and the drawbacks
Mm,
of being neurodivergent. Um, I think there's something there's a question on whose responsibility it is to manage that. Is it the
mm,
individual? Is it the manager to play them to their strengths, or is it the organisation to adapt the systems, processes to
Mm.
get the best from people who are neurodivergent? So my question is, where does responsibility lie?
Mm. Can I answer that with a bit of a segue? Is that okay?
Yes, yeah, let's do it.
I know this is your show.
No,
If
let's
we
do it.
take a step back from that, and we will answer that question. We'd spoken sort of off camera about sort of why does it matter. I prepared some stats for you, so hopefully this will give some context, and then we'll touch on absolutely on responsibility. Why does it
Great.
matter? So Nancy Doyle, an expert in the space, she writes all the books that I have. She and the team at Birkbeck University, they did some research last year, so really recent stuff. Over 1,000 responses. People saying, 64% of people, 64.7% were worried about stigma from managers, not from their employees or teammates, but from managers. Another survey by the Institute of Leadership, I think a couple of years ago, said that 50% of employers wouldn't employ someone with a neurological condition. And if it's because of that, that is illegal. That is discrimination. The national autistic, there was a national autistic survey, I think 2016. 77% of autistic adults were out of work but wanted to work. So all of this is why it's important in terms of like understanding it. We've got, as I said, about 20% of the population who isn't necessarily getting the most out of themselves, isn't necessarily being given the opportunity to give their best version of themselves. So to answer your question, whose responsibility is it? I absolutely think the employers should be the first sort of owners, should we say, of the responsibility. Reason being, as an employer, big or small, you generally have a bit more resource than the individual. Certainly the companies I've worked in, and I know you've worked in, have big teams, have big sets of resources. And there's a misconception that understanding neurodiversity or even adjusting, however small, to neurodiversity has to be expensive, has to be costly. It really doesn't, and I'm sure we'll get into that too. But as an employer, you are responsible for sort of all the different touch points of not just your clients, but also your employees. So, everything from the website that you have, the job descriptions that you write, the interview process, all of these things can be adjusted really, really small ways and have a really big difference. Again, I remember when I did eventually realize and got my ADHD diagnosis, I said, oh, this sort of makes sense, I guess, because I'm dyspraxic. And they turned around and they said, wait, what? You never told us that. And that's a really good example of how somewhere along the line in the employment process, I probably ticked the box saying, I don't have any conditions, but I just don't think about these things necessarily all the time. And if you never get asked again, or if you don't have a sort of opportunity to discuss or decide, or are even asked, then it will just be an empty box that wasn't filled and could have consequences. In my case, it wasn't so bad, but it's this idea that sometimes, as you said, the individual doesn't know themselves. Sometimes they do know, but they're not sure how or whether they should disclose. And so, as an employer, you can do small things like surveys, allowing for self-disclosure. I've seen companies do really great things with affinity groups and particularly having sort of senior sponsors, that sort of thing. And then as employees, I think there is a degree of ownership, on the employee. And by that, I mean, it's very personal. So some people disclose. I disclosed straight away. As I said, I was straight to acceptance. Some people, they don't, and they fear discrimination. I spoke to someone just 2 days ago who I believe and they believe was fired from a role illegally because they disclosed the condition to HR, that somehow that information sort of made it across the team and managers, and this individual sort of claims that they were bullied as a result of it. So these can be quite sensitive things, but at the same time, it doesn't need to be overly complex either.
Yes. Okay. So it sounds like first and foremost, the responsibility and the emphasis is on the managers, leaders, and the organization to create the environment that allows neurodivergent people not only to sort of exist, but actually to be accepted, to be cherished, to thrive. Um, because without that, people won't even share it. If they are aware, they won't even share it because they won't feel safe to, because of these sort of horror stories that you mention. Um,
Mm.
I think in terms of what if you are listening to this and you are neurodiverse sorry, neurodivergent in whatever way, what would you encourage those people to do, especially if you feel like
Hmm.
they're in an environment which may not necessarily accept and cherish their differences?
Hmm. Yeah, great question. So, the first step I often invite people to think about is like, what does it mean to me? What does it look like? So, I've given you a couple of little anecdotes about small things, maybe that had small impacts, but there were, along the way, there were sort of big things that had big impacts, which I realized as I was going through the process. I was like, I think this was related. So, sort of capturing that, what are the strengths that I think it gives me? What are the challenges that perhaps are linked? What do I think is important to my employer, um, and sort of just capturing that personal element, because as we've said, no one goes through the same experience, and we haven't touched on so much, but a really big part is this sort of intersectionality. We're made of many things, and we may have many other labels. I might be white, middle class, male, according to some people, and we might have all these other sort of elements, and that's why environment can play a really big part as well. But the first thing I'd say is understand what it means for me, um, and try and capture and be able to articulate that, even just if it's to yourself out loud.
Mm,
Um, if you feel comfortable telling HR, as we've touched on, they should hold that privately. They shouldn't be
mm,
leaking that.
mm,
Then you could ask your options. You could ask if the company has a DE&I inclusion policy, for example,
mm,
whether there's neurodiversity is included in that explicitly or not. You don't necessarily have to disclose your condition, but you may just show interest in, actually, there's an affinity group in my business, or someone in my team has mentioned they or a friend of theirs has X condition, and sort of just speaking to them on a sort of more informal basis. The companies I've seen do this really well in their company culture have a really sort of top down, quite transparent, quite human approach to, I've seen board members stand up and say, this is what it was like to discover that my son was autistic and get him the
mm,
support that he needed, and now to watch him thrive. It's a really sort of human approach to breaking down the barriers, as you say.
mm,
And then the final thing is just think about the people that you trust, the people that you can speak to, bounce off of. As that sort of famous saying goes, a problem shared is a problem halved. And it could be outside of work, it could be a partner, it could be a friend, it could be a family member. Um, and walk through, actually, this is what I'm worried about. Is that likely? Is that impact going, if it does happen, is it going to be significant? And I'm sort of not here to alarm people, far from it. But sometimes we can build things up in our head so that they seem worse than they end up being. But also, as we said, we don't know what we don't know. So exploring it, whether it's online, video resources, charities, there's a lot of support out there if we know where to look. But often we don't know that because we haven't been told much about it. So
mm.
understandably, it can feel daunting.
Great. So I love those three steps, and let's now go back to what we can. If you know somebody around you is
Mm.
neurodivergent, what you can do to support them. Before we do that, though, just a thought in my mind is
Mm.
diversity in general is not one thing, right? So you have you talked about
Absolutely.
intersectionality, so you've got diversity of um, ethnicity, race, age, gender, sexuality, etc., etc., etc. Right? Thinking patterns, values. Um, I imagine when we're talking about spiky profiles, it's the same for neurodivergence, right? So I imagine the exact challenges and the exact strengths in spiky profiles differ from person to person. What I'd love to hear, if that is the case, is what are the common strengths and the common things that different people struggle with, before we then start to talk about how you can then
Mm,
support people with those different types of
mm.
challenges.
Yeah, sure. So it will vary by condition, and we could spend probably an hour on each. And actually, the umbrella term of neurodiversity is sort of constantly flexing as we sort of collectively, as a society, understand what falls into it, fully or partially. Um, if we take, for example, ADHD and dyspraxia, my conditions that I feel most comfortable talking about, um, you might see lack of concentration, so that people expect that from ADHD, that sort of attention deficit, sometimes as a challenge. But equally, on the flip of that, what we don't talk about enough is how sometimes these are two sides of the same coin. So actually, when I'm really interested in something, when I'm on a roll, I have real hyper focus and I can just do something. I always say that on a bad day, I'm probably doing the work of half a person, but on a good day, I'm doing the work of 5 people. I just feel like a real Trojan, just sort of powering through, no matter what's in my way. Um, so, focus is one area. Energy levels can be something that fluctuates again, with regardless of spiky profile. This idea of we haven't touched on it yet, but this idea of masking, which is the idea of trying to outwardly look like you're doing fine, outwardly keep up with everyone else, whereas inwardly know, oh, I'm spending a lot of mental bandwidth just to catch up on people. And I think that's something that I had done without realizing, this idea that people were like, oh, you're being promoted, things are fine. And I was like, yeah, but this is a struggle the whole time. And therefore, the sort of energy crash that can come with, when you haven't regulated necessarily. Um, as you say, different conditions will have different areas, but you may find, for example, that communication, I remember having at times when I'd go to a meeting with my manager and we'd leave with very different interpretations of the same meeting, and that inevitably causes a bit of confusion, right? So, in terms of how do we navigate that, could be as simple as allocating a note taker, or having a voice transcription software like Otter AI. Now, would you make the person with slow processing speeds the note taker for a big meeting? Possibly not. So again, just really minor adjustments of just acknowledging, okay, I know this person's a really, really great creative thinker, but they've told me that note taking and the handwriting isn't, they write slowly, or they feel uncomfortable writing notes. Those sorts of things. Other adjustments, as we've touched on, there's this sort of misconception that they have to be really expensive, really costly. And I think a lot of employers also fear a sort of slippery slope effect. They're like, if I give one tiny adjustment to one employee, I have to suddenly open the floodgates to every single complaint or query or concern that comes in. That's not true. The adjustments we're talking about, they generally help everyone. This idea that a rising tide lifts all boats is, again, another one of my favorite sayings. This idea of, if we have a quiet zone in the office, again, I was speaking to a Magic Circle lawyer, earlier this week. He said, working previously, they had a shared office between themselves and one other person. That was sort of manageable with their ADHD and autism prior to COVID. They
Mm,
came back from COVID. Suddenly they're in a bullpen, is an open plan office. Really, really difficult for them. I speak to another employee. Again, they said, I'd really like just a sort of quiet space in the office. I've seen these empty rooms. Could I use these empty rooms that they're not even used for meetings? Turns out they're reserved for board members, and even though they're used sort of 5% of the time, they're not allowed to go in. The other members of the team are not allowed to go in and use
mm,
these empty rooms, which seems like a bit of a no-brainer. The room's there; it's not costing anymore.
mm,
Um, things like that.
yeah.
We've touched on, or I've mentioned briefly, about things like job descriptions and the onboarding process. Also really important. I think I saw a statistic. Yeah, 53% of employers haven't adapted their recruitment process for
Mm,
neurodiversity. So again, you're potentially losing out on a quarter of the workforce who, as we've identified, can over-index with creativity, can over-index with problem-solving skills, or whatever they might
yeah.
be. And those adjustments can be really simple. Job
Yeah.
descriptions are often really long with a need to have list that's 50 lines long, that's really unrealistic. Um, and certain sort of words, buzzwords especially, like say flexible working. What flexible working looks like to me might be different to what flexible working looks like to you. So taking a line or two to explain what that means and just
Mm,
being a little
mm,
bit clearer to avoid any ambiguity, avoid any
mm.
confusion. As I say, it doesn't cost a lot, it doesn't discriminate, but it
Yeah.
helps an awful lot of people, whether they're neurodivergent or not.
Yes. So in terms of the common challenges then and the strengths, it sounds like
Mm,
some of them are around, attention, but actually that has the flip side of also hyper focus at times as a strength, um, often around communication. And you've already mentioned lots of different strategies that both you as a manager can take and the organization can take in order to get the best from neurodivergent people. Um, let's say you are a manager listening into this and you
mhm,
suspect somebody in your team is neurodivergent. Perhaps they've said that to you, or perhaps it's something you something you suspect. What do you what do you do about it? What are the first, second, third things that you should be doing? Because I'm getting loads
yeah,
of great strategies, but what's like the first thing you should do? Then like
yeah.
what's the order of events?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, what we've touched on there is my ADHD brain doesn't always work very linearly. As I say, sort of quite. Um, I always think of it as like a shooting star of ideas and solutions, and then it often takes me to rein them back, or in this case, you to rein me back in.
It's all
Um,
good.
no, and I think this is a really, really important point. Is it appropriate for a manager who suspects a member of their team to be neurodivergent to sort of tell them that? No, I don't think so. But certainly to educate themselves, ask the HR team, do we have any resources on this? I sort of suspect this might be the case, or
Mm,
perhaps I've had a hint that this is the case. Is there anything I can do just privately to educate myself on it? Again, is there a policy? Is there an internal advocacy group or affinity group that I could join? A phrase I come to a lot, especially in this sort of circumstance where as a manager you may not know how to approach it, is approach with curiosity, not judgment. So,
mm,
you know, um, I was very open in disclosing my conditions. And what that created was an environment where actually my colleagues were like quite curious and they said, oh, thanks for sharing that. I don't really know much about it. Is that okay if you tell me again what it means for you, that sort of thing? So whether anyone's disclosing it or not, just come with curiosity, not judgment. Again, those
mm,
preconceptions, those stereotypes of, oh, well, if you've got this, then that must mean you are automatically bad at X, or
mm, mm.
my cousin also has it, therefore I'm going to sort of tie you
Got
with
it.
my whatever preconceptions I have with my cousin. Leave those judgments, leave those preconceptions at the door, accept each individual for what they are. Um, as I said, understand if your organization has resources. Um, and as I say, start to signpost where appropriate. We've talked about things like surveys can help people who may want to disclose in a sort of an anonymized way before they're ready to talk about it. As we've talked about, senior leaders coming forward and sharing their experiences can have a big impact. And if I'm going through the process, perhaps I'm not ready to tell my manager or HR, but I may know that sales director really well, and I may just ask them quietly, you know, is this something you think I could share, or whatever it might be.
Mm.
So curiosity, not judgment, is for me the shining star here.
Okay, great. So I'm just sort of organizing my notes as I'm listening, and I think what I've sort of got is a list of different things that you can do as a manager and you can do as an organization. So I just want to list them out, and what I'd love to know is if
Mm,
I've missed any or if I've misunderstood
sure,
anything. So as a manager, it sounds like asking HR what already exists or seeking information, showing curiosity rather than sort of being judgmental. You also talked about playing to strengths, so going with the spiky profile as opposed to expecting a jack of all
absolutely.
trades. Um, And then this idea of a rising tide lifts all boats. So making adjustments that will probably help that individual, but they'll likely benefit the whole team. Then from the organization, I've heard lots of things around surveys to make sure that you're understanding what the needs of people in your workforce, affinity groups for neurodivergent individuals, senior leaders sharing sort of vulnerability and sharing their personal stories to make it sort of feel like it's okay to be open about this. And then job descriptions as well, being really precise with the language around job descriptions. They're all the sort of little tips and tricks that I picked up. Are there any that I've misunderstood, or any that you would build on?
Yeah. I mean, for a start, you did a great job. You picked up pretty much everything I think you've talked about. I'll give you an anecdote. I remember going to one interview, and this role had been empty for a little while, and so the business was quite keen to fill the role. So when it got to my final round interview, you know, I think the first round interview had been one or two people, manager and HR, something like that, and the final round interview had something like six or seven different leaders and members of the board, things like that, because everyone was so keen. Can we fill this role, and how is it going to impact my role? And it was quite intimidating for me just coming in and having seven of the most senior people in this business. But interestingly, the feedback I got afterwards was, "Oh, you didn't look in people's eyes very much." And I thought, well, there are seven of you, and that was an example for me of how I totally understand in the moment. Everyone wants to meet a potential new guy, and
Mm,
they're going to help my team, so on. But just thinking about the implication, neurodivergent or not, is seven people in a room with one person, and it was a small room too. Is that overwhelming?
mm,
So
mm,
small approaches like that. Um,
mm,
Other things I've sort of written down in advance. It could be major, large scale things, which doesn't always have to be. But if you are moving office, renovating, whatever it might be, can there be a quiet zone, a quiet corner, um, a I would love to see someone invent like a traffic light that I could put on my screen, on top of my screen, that says like, green for come talk to me, red for don't talk to me, that sort of thing. I'd love someone to invent that beyond the sort of Zoom or Teams, red, amber, green. Um, but small things, if you do know someone has a condition, allowing extra breaks, for example, or for them to stand up in a meeting, could be standing desks, or providing noise cancelling headphones, those sorts of things. If you're going in a sort of more practical or larger scale change, but it can be small things too. I've seen organizations leading by example where they have senior leaders and members of the team say in their email
mm,
signature, just so you know, I am dyslexic, so some of my emails may well be, incorrectly spelled, that sort of thing. Just
mm,
breaking down the barriers so that people don't feel intimidated, overwhelmed, or sort of hushed into silence, shall we say. Um,
yeah.
Sorry,
Sorry, go on.
go ahead.
I was just going to
No,
say,
I
it
think
sounds like
I'm trying
a,
to.
go on, you go.
Well, no, I'm just looking at what I've written down, and I think the email signature one is a really good example for me of how these things can be so small, they don't
Mm,
cost any money, and they
mm,
can be quite impactful. Um, yeah, we could talk all day about sort of practical steps to take and team dynamics and things like that. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do, regardless of our team, regardless of our role, is accept that we have different strengths and different backgrounds. We're generally pretty good at accepting different backgrounds
mm,
and different
mm,
skill sets, but we tend not to think about that in our working styles. So, in much the same way that maybe you're familiar with insights and things like that, and you want a sort of well balanced team between yellow and green and blue and red, whatever it might be. Similar sort of thing here is going, actually, if I know I've got a really creative thinker, but they're slow handwriting, I'm not going to make them the note taker.
mm,
And
mm,
think about the dynamics to allow the teammates to sort of decide between themselves how they work best together. Do you prefer a phone call? Do you prefer me coming up to you?
mm, mm.
Would you? Another common one, really simple, is just allowing people to have a meeting-free, portion of their day, and say, do you know what? I'm going to allow you to catch up or take a breather, or whatever it might be.
I think what I love about these ideas is they're things that would, it's the rising tides, what is it, rising, a rising tide lifts all boats. All these things that you've said, they're
That's it.
just good leadership and management per se in general.
Right.
And so it's not extra, it's not necessarily extra things to do. It's just if you're doing those things already, great. And we would encourage you to do more of those things as opposed to it feeling like an extra, long list of extra things you need to do because you've got a neurodivergent person in your team or whatever it might be. So out of all of those strategies, because we've got a long list here of things that you can do as an individual, things as a manager, and things as an organization. Here's a question that I ask everybody who comes onto the show, and it'll probably be the last big question.
Mhm.
What's a culture hack that you love? So something that takes a little effort but can have a big
Mm.
impact. That could be something we've already discussed, or it could be something different.
Yeah, for me, I'm going to mention it again. It's the email signature one. I only sort of thought about this and saw this in practice relatively recently in the last sort of
Mm,
few months, in practice, and I thought, wow, that's
okay.
really healthy, really warming to see. And again, like so often, the sort of good practice, it does sort of trickle down. You see other people
Mm,
doing it, and
mm,
and that can, as we say, that then leads to people approaching with curiosity, not judgment. So for
mm.
me, the sort of soft signals, whatever they look like, whatever you feel comfortable doing, those for me are a great starting point.
And I imagine it's even more powerful if those things come from the senior leader, right? Because or senior leaders or managers,
Absolutely.
'cause that sends a really powerful message that it's okay to be open about it. Awesome,
Mm.
fantastic. So we could talk about this all day, and I'm really conscious of your time and the listeners' time. Do you have any final reflections on our conversation before we close, Frank?
Uh, Only that time has absolutely flown. We have had fun, or certainly I've had fun. So thanks again for having me. Um, as I say, we could talk about specific parts of these in depth for like an
Mm,
hour each. So thanks for giving all of this important stuff the airtime that I certainly believe it deserves.
absolutely.
Hopefully, your audience will agree. And as I said, my only sort of parting gift is, if in doubt, ask.
Mm,
Compassionately, approach with that curiosity, not judgment. And just remember that not everyone will have their own answers yet. We will go on different
mm,
journeys in life. We will have a different starting point and a different end point in general. And so just because someone tells you, oh, I've got a diagnosis, or I think I might have
mm.
this, I'm going through a process, doesn't mean they will necessarily have a checklist of 10 things that they
Yes.
want from you straight away. It
Yeah.
might take some time for them to work it out. And for you as a manager or as a leader, um, the best thing you can do is listen, and support,
Yeah.
and keep that dialogue open.
So it's about being curious and being patient, which again, it sounds like that they are just important leadership traits in general, right? And it's
Absolutely.
just continuing to do that. So thank you so much for sharing your time and experiences today, Frank. I really do appreciate it.
My
If people
pleasure,
do
Matt.
want to,
I've really, really enjoyed it.
awesome. And if people do want to contact you, what's the best way for them to do so?
Yeah, so I deliberately keep a low profile. I'm trying to stay away on TikTok and Instagram and everything for now. But best way to find me is the website, so
Okay.
consciousclarity.co.uk, and also on LinkedIn. I go through periods where I post a lot, periods where I get sort of overwhelmed by it. But
Mm,
yeah, LinkedIn and the website, consciousclarity.co.uk.
awesome. Thank you so much, Frank. So I think that's all for today. So if you like this episode, please do listen to our other episodes for more first-hand experiences and lessons on all things culture. Otherwise, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you, Frank, and go well, everybody.